Som. Boa tarde a todo mundo. Bem-vindos ao Filigram. Estamos dando continuidade à nossa programação dedicada à cadeia produtiva do livro, ao mercado editorial. Meu nome é Vitor Dil, estarei fazendo esta mediação com o nosso convidado, chamado Michael Baskar, que vai falar diretamente de Londres, online, teremos uma conversa online. Farei a apresentação do nosso convidado, o Michael já está aqui no telão. Temos tradução simultânea, quem quiser acompanhar pode retirar os fones de ouvido para ouvir a tradução simultânea, basta deixar um documento, os fones podem ser retirados nas maletas que estão na entrada do auditório, então basta deixar um documento e você tem acesso à tradução simultânea. Michael Baskar é escritor, pesquisador e produtor de conteúdo digital. É cofundador da Canelo Digital Publishing. Michael já escreveu e palestrou sobre o futuro das mídias, as indústrias criativas e a economia do mundo tecnológico em jornais, revistas e blogs. Suas matérias tiveram destaque no The Guardian, Financial Times, Wired e Daily Telegraph, assim como na BBC 2, BBC Radio 4, NPR, Bloomberg TV, entre outras. Já trabalhou como produtor de conteúdo digital, pesquisador da área da economia e resenhista, além de ser autor de várias iniciativas na web. É formado em literatura inglesa pela Universidade de Oxford, onde venceu o prêmio Gibbs. Foi jovem empreendedor criativo pelo British Council e fellow da Feira do Livro de Frankfurt. Também é autor de Content Machine e coeditor de um livro sobre o mercado editorial ainda no prelo. O Michael está aqui, nós estamos recebendo o Michael na tarde de hoje, porque ele vai falar sobre este tema, que é o resultado da sua pesquisa, que deu origem a este livro, que se chama Curadoria, o poder da seleção no mundo do excesso. Então, o Michael é um pesquisador a respeito do papel, da importância da curadoria na pós-modernidade, quando nós temos o excesso de informação, temos muitas fontes nas quais nós podemos ou não confiar em diferentes medidas. Então, Michael é um pesquisador a respeito da importância da curadoria na modernidade e ele é uma pessoa muito qualificada para falar a respeito. Então, vamos receber o Michael. Michael, boa tarde, bem-vindo a Filigram.
Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me?
Sim, yes.
Okay, great. I will try and start. Right, I'm just firstly sorry I can't be with you. Obviously, I'm here in the UK, and yeah, you know. Sorry, I'm just getting a lot of. I can just hear myself, a delay, which is a bit strange. So I might see if I do this, does that make any difference? No.
We are going to check the delay, Michael.
Yes, it's just. I'll try and just go with it if possible, but I can just sort of hear myself. Maybe if I take these out. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Can you still hear me? Yes. Okay. I'll talk like this. So great to be with you. I'm here talking about the idea of curation, and I will start with how I got interested in this idea, and then I'll just go through why I think it's important, why I think curation, is seemingly quite old word, is one of the most important ideas of the 21st century. And hopefully by the end of the talk, you will be convinced of that claim. But I'll start by saying that I wasn't always convinced of that. For a long time, I thought that when people started to talk about this idea of curation, they were just posturing. they were talking about curation just to make themselves sound very cool or sound interesting. That it didn't actually mean all that much. So I started out as a bit of a skeptic about curation. I used to hear it a lot because I'd go to conferences about digital publishing around 10, 12 years ago, certainly in the UK and in the US and perhaps in Brazil as well. There was a lot of excitement about ebooks. And the whole book world and the whole publishing industry had started to feel, well, technology is going to take over everything. Ebooks are going to take over everything. The print book is just going to die and go away. And one of the reactions to this was that everyone would have conferences all of the time to discuss it. And I would go to as many of these conferences as I could because I thought it would be interesting. I thought it was an exciting time. So I'd go along to these conferences, and the one word that I would hear again and again was curation. And I would see it in the newspapers. I'd see people talking about curating their wine list, or go to a restaurant and they curate the menu. All of these uses of the word curation that I thought were a bit silly, to be honest. It's just ironic that in the end I've somehow, ended up writing a book about curation. So anyway, sorry, I'm just having my children screaming in the background, which is one of the perils of doing these things remotely. Anyway, so I started out as a curation skeptic, but I ended up writing a book about it. I wonder if you too are also skeptical of the word curation. Let me outline why you shouldn't be. So firstly, curation. Where does this word come from? Well, I think in both Portuguese and in the Latin, and in English, it comes from the Latin, curare, to take care of. You had curators in the Roman Empire. They were the people looking after the infrastructure. You had curators in the church as well, and curates. So it's this idea that has this ancient history. But it really only started to become a real job in about the 18th and 19th century, when you got the creation of the first massive museums. So a brilliant example of this would be the Louvre in Paris, where you had what at the time was the world's biggest private collection of art, that is, the collection of art from the French royal family. And then suddenly, after the French Revolution, that is made public. They turn the palace into a museum that any citizen can go to. So you have this very unusual situation with the Louvre or with the British Museum in London, where you have the birth of a museum, and a museum where the problem is that you have too much art to display. You have to decide what you're going to display and in what order, how you're going to choose it. And that's where you get this role of the curator coming into museums. They're the people putting on the exhibitions. They're the people managing this huge amount of stuff that you've got. So for the first time, you get this traditional idea of curation. And when most people think of curation until recently, that was what they're talking about. I think then this role takes on a new importance when you get into the art world in the 20th century. Before the 20th century, it was quite obvious what art was. Everyone could say, right, well, there's a painting on a wall. That's art. But then in the 20th century, you've got people like Marcel Duchamp, who would just put a wheel or a urinal in an art gallery and say, well, that's art. So suddenly in the world of modern art, you have this situation where what is in a gallery and what is not in a gallery is basically what tells you if something's art or not. And so suddenly the person who chooses what goes in the gallery has a lot more power and influence. And that's what we see in the modern art world. the modern art world has these big art fairs and so on. It has its great artists, it has its big collectors and so on. But the real power brokers, that have been called the popes of art, are the curators. And these are people who've got a lot of wealth and influence and power in the art world. So from that little world of museums, the idea of curators in art became a big deal. And in many ways, that's the traditional idea of professional curation. It's people who put on exhibitions. It's people who work in museums and art galleries. It's people who curate shows there. That's what I used to think curation was. And that's what I think is still often what other people think as well. It's certainly the case that those kind of curators, traditional museum curators and art world curators, they hate it when anyone has a different sense of what's going on. They really like to jealously guard their own sort of profession. So what changed? How did everything change? Somehow curation went from being this quite niche, small job in art galleries and museums to being this huge buzzword, to being this thing that you'd hear at technology conferences, to being something that you'd read about in the newspaper, to being something that would annoy you or interest you. Well, in a word, what changed was the internet. Suddenly the internet took that problem that you had at the Louvre, that problem of having too much stuff to display at any one time. It took that problem and it supercharged it. The internet is built on a just massive abundance of content. And ultimately, in many ways, the era of the internet is the era of superabundant content. And an era of superabundant content needs somebody to manage it. The value add of a role in this world changes from being the one to just produce more stuff to being the one that selects and displays what is important within it. So from the very early days of the internet, there was this sense that curation was important. And in fact, certainly in the English language, we can see that uses of the word really start going up about when the internet comes in the 1990s. So suddenly, curation really matters. This context of abundance changes everything. Curation is suddenly important. So let me just build out this idea of abundance a bit, because, I think most people feel like we're in a world that still has a lot of problems, and yes, it does. Certainly in this turbulent modern times we live in, it feels like perhaps the days of abundance are over. At least a lot of people in Britain, I think, feel like that. Certainly there will be a lot of people in Brazil who would say, well, maybe it's never even started at all. But nonetheless, when you look at a graph of economic growth over history, over the last 50 years, it has gone vertical. There has been more economic growth in the space of, say, 10 or 20 years this century than in 500 years or thousands of years in history. So we definitely have more stuff. In terms of information and informational goods and data, we absolutely have a complete overload of that. Every 2 years, the amount of data in the world more than doubles. So it's a crazy exponential growth in data that is just being pumped out by every society on Earth now. They almost keep having to invent new kind of mathematical categories to really comprehend how much data is being created every day and just how much storage is required. Professionally, I'm a book publisher, and I can tell you that the problem of book publishing today is not producing books. Actually, the problem of book publishing is that there are just far, far, far too many books published every year. Globally, in the English language, there are something like 5 million new books released every year. And of course, think that on top of that, there are all of the books that were published last year, all of the great classics that sit there. The problem of publishing is just that there's about the same number of readers, maybe fewer readers than ever, but just more and more and more books. So that's the issue. And this issue is also felt in a lot of other industries as well. Take, for example, music. If you go on a service like Spotify, you have something like 40 million songs. Every day, they're adding something like 60,000 songs to Spotify. It is just a deluge of music, the likes of which nobody has ever really experienced before. If you would have told somebody 100 years ago that actually, in 2022, people will walk around with access to 40 million songs on them at all times, I think that would have just been an absolutely mind-blowing thing. And it's just the sheer scale of that is the mind-blowing thing. But obviously, the value add of just adding one additional song to Spotify is almost nothing. The value add of helping people navigate those 40 million songs is huge. And Spotify knows this, and it's premised on finding ways to help people navigate the superabundance that it itself has created. I can talk a bit later about some of the ways that it's done that and the investments that it's made and the strategic decisions that it's made. But I guess my picture is that book publishing, internet media, songs, all of them just facing superabundance. Another example, television, moving images. People are starting to talk about peak TV. The number of big budget TV programs that are made every year is more than ever before by a long way. There are more channels on TV than ever before. Then there's YouTube. Then there's TikTok. If you want moving images, the modern world just presents a total saturation of moving images. We don't face a scarcity of things to watch. We face an absolute overload of things to watch. This does all have an impact. The average American consumes information that is equivalent to something like 175 newspapers every day. So that's the newspapers they read, but it's their emails, it's the TV, it's the adverts you see on the way to work. It's just everything. It's all the notifications coming through on your mobile phone. It's when you're watching TV in the evening and browsing on Facebook. What's staggering about that is that if you went back to, say, the medieval times and you just took somebody who's a peasant living in a village, they maybe saw in their whole lives media, as in, written writing and recorded images that would be equivalent to about 4 newspapers. And that would be what you had access to in your entire life. And now we have hundreds of times that every single day. So this is what mad information overload looks like. And I'd say it also exists to some extent in the physical world as well. On Amazon.com now, there's something like 600 million products listed as for sale. Now, a lot of those, they will kind of make that product bespoke when you order it, but it's staggering to think that you can, right now, on your computer, go and buy one of 600 million different things through one website alone. Again, it's overload. So this is the context that I'm talking about that I think makes curation really valuable. And I think it means that we need a new and much clearer and broader and more powerful definition than from just people working in museums or art galleries. And my definition is quite simple. Curation is when we select things and we arrange things in order to add value. That's it. Whenever you see that pattern, what you're seeing is people curating. And the more you start looking for that pattern, the more you start seeing it as a kind of major structural component of the modern world that is repeated so many places. You know, go back to my own industry, book publishing. Is my job as an editor just to pump out more and more and more books? Or is it to find and select the very, very best books and then try and introduce those to an audience? I think, you know, we all know what it has to be. What I think we're building now is what I call the curation economy. And the sort of advanced economy of the world is a curation economy. Let me give you a few examples of this. A few years ago, Blockbuster, the old video rental store, was given the chance of buying a fledgling startup called Netflix. It was given the chance to buy the company for a very small amount of money. That was in, I think, the early 2000s. And it turned that down. Now, of course, Netflix is a multi-hundred billion dollar media giant, and Blockbuster is just completely defunct and bankrupt. And what I think happened is that you had two different models of curation. The Blockbuster model of curation was sort of industrial. You'd have all of the hits in large quantities. There wasn't really that much choice. It wasn't personalized. It wasn't particularly interesting, but you might find what you want. The Netflix model started out very different. You know, what you had was a much, much wider possible catalog of things that you could watch. Remember, Netflix started out hiring out DVDs, so it was exactly the same sort of business as Blockbuster. But it had a much larger catalog that you could access at any one time. And what Netflix would do is it would take that big catalog and it would help you find the exact right film for you. So Blockbuster had this really old-fashioned form of curation. Netflix had this slightly more evolved, powerful form of curation. And, you know, fast forward 20 years and the rest is history. And I think that's just an example of the kind of thing that we see all the time. Let me give you another example. I'm not sure if this is still true after the pandemic, and I think this may have changed, but certainly when I originally wrote the book Curation, the shopping mall that has the highest rents in the world was the IFC shopping mall in Hong Kong. So right there on Hong Kong Island, underneath the skyscraper, you know, it was super high value, and you'd have lots of rich people from Hong Kong, from mainland China, from all over Southeast Asia and East Asia and the world going to this shopping mall to buy things. And, you know, you might think, well, you know, managing a shopping mall, that's not curation. That's as far away as you can get from the rarefied atmosphere of working in a museum. Well, you'd sort of be right. But equally, what this shopping mall did wasn't quite what you'd expect either. They could charge any amount of money to all of the big, obvious brands. You know, they could go to, you know, any designer label and say, you have to pay just an unfeasible amount of money to have a shop here. But they didn't really do that, and that wasn't what they were about. Actually, what they were about was going out and selecting quite obscure but trendy new up-and-coming names and things like that. The shopping mall manager wanted this unique blend of shops and experiences that couldn't be replicated anywhere else in Asia. And they saw their job not just as doing all the obvious stuff that the other shopping malls would do, but it was in curating this unique set of experiences. And that helped underwrite its value as the most valuable one. So, you know, we live in a world where even a shopping mall can be curated, and that isn't absurd or stupid. That actually enables them to make more money than virtually anything else. I'll keep going on some of the examples. In Abu Dhabi, they are building an island called Saadiyat Island, and it has some huge museums on it. Again, it has a Louvre on it, it has various large art galleries and so on. And this is curation in a different sense. What they're sort of saying is, you know, we're going to build a post-oil economy through curation. It's getting the patina of it, that's going to be really interesting. And honestly, when you start thinking about so many jobs, whether you're a newspaper editor or whether you are picking stocks and shares, what you're doing is curating. Having expertise, deep expertise and understanding is allowing you to make selections and to arrange them in interesting ways, to use your picks to add value, to do something different, to combine things in new and unexpected ways. And it is crucial that I say that you know, this is about expertise. I think a huge debate is about the role of technology in curation. And, you know, does machine learning curate or not? My view is that to manage that great overabundance that I talked about, we need machines, we need technology. But I also think we need human beings. We need the subjective stories that we bring. We need the idiosyncratic knowledge. I think we value that. We like that. And so for me, a big story of curation is going to be these blends of human expertise with new technology. And that's something that we see. So to go back to Spotify and music as an example, Spotify has invested vast amounts of resources in something called audio fingerprinting, where you can automatically take features about a song and then recommend other songs based on that. You know, it even spent $250 million buying a startup that had spun out of MIT in that exact area. But what Spotify has also spent a lot of time and money doing is hiring DJs, in hiring music critics, in just working with people in the space, whether they're artists or DJs or whatever, to create playlists. So these are highly personal playlists. They're from a story. They're not just an algorithm recommending music. And actually, what I think makes Spotify so well curated, what makes those 40 million songs so valuable, is that really clever blend of the human expertise with augmented by technology. So I think, again, it hints at some of the ways that curation is becoming really important. Retail is completely changing. And earlier I mentioned Amazon, and I think that's a sort of hint of what's going on. One of the sort of predictions that I made when I wrote the book, and one of the predictions that I think has been borne out, is that the middle portion of retail is collapsing. And what we're being left with is, on the one hand, very cheap bulk retail. And again, I don't know whether this is true in Brazil. I think it's certainly true in the UK. On the one hand, we're left with bulk, cheap retail, so super discount. There's not really that much choice, but they're selling things really cheap. Those people are doing very well. Then at the other end, there are hyper-curated, quite expensive, really just super curated shops. And they're also doing quite well. They might be catering to local interest. They might be catering to a niche interest. They might just be very expensive and sort of sourcing things. My favorite example of this is the food shop Italy, and just the exceptional care with which every single item of food in that shop is chosen. You know, they go down to the specific village in Italy that they're sourcing their products from. And, you know, Italy as a company is doing really well. The really cheap supermarkets are doing really well. But anyone in the middle is absolutely suffering. And certainly in Britain, what we've seen is that what we call the high street, what in America they call Main Street, you know, the main shopping centers of towns and small cities, they're really struggling. Because today, if you're in retail, you're either selling based on exceptional curation or you're selling based on cheap price. And anything that isn't working on one of those two is really falling apart. And so I think it's an important part of the world is that retailers are having to make a choice. Then when I was writing the book, I think I hadn't fully realized one thing, and that was how, as I was writing it, the whole issue of curation would become a massive geopolitical flashpoint. You know, suddenly what people saw online, what messages got through, how they were shared, what platforms displayed them and why, went from being kind of interesting to some people who are interested in the internet to being something that mattered to everyone. You know, that was what happened when we live in the world of Brexit or the world of Trump. These things became controversial, you know, and no doubt there's a lot of similar things that we could talk about in Brazil that I won't comment on. The point is that internet curation became political and it became significant, and it was no longer, oh, well, you know, isn't it nice that people are curating this or curating that? It was actually suddenly, well, the algorithmic curation of Facebook can have global consequences that are really quite enormous. And so that is what changed. Curation suddenly became a buzzword that wasn't even just a nice kind of internet thing. It was a huge deal that called into question who has power, why they have power, what are the ethics of making choices, who should be able to make those choices. And I think, again, it hints at some of the key questions around curation, you know, and a question I often get asked, what is good curation? And I think, you know, the first answer is that good curation has really, really deep expertise. Like, you cannot fake good curation. It just comes from really understanding something. But there's also another layer. There's a layer of judgment and perhaps even moral judgment. You know, that's why somebody like Facebook now employs something like 10 to 20,000 people, largely in the Philippines, who just look through content, marking stuff as not appropriate. A lot of these people are, you know, fairly battle-scarred by this. They have to see an awful lot of really bad, nasty stuff. But it's done by a human because these things are ultimately deemed to need a kind of moral judgment. A machine might flag it, but it needs a person to do it. So good curation is about expertise, but it's also about something more than that, I think. I never quite know if moral judgment is the way of doing it. I think the other value of human curation is that it's still the way we find the unexpected. You know, we live in a world where, despite all this superabundance, the algorithms and the machines are just going to recommend things in filter bubbles. Because we've liked something, we'll get recommended more things like that. We buy one kind of book on Amazon, and then the system just keeps pumping us those kind of books. We watch one show on Netflix, again. It always stuns me when I go into my wife's Netflix profile. It's like a completely different site. and I can't believe these are even, technically the same platform. We get stuck in our bubbles. Actually, the way out of that kind of automated curation is human curation. Human curation that surprises us. Human curation that really is going to say, look, you might think this is crazy, but give this a try. You might like it. And again, the more abundance there is, the more we get bored of just sitting around in our own preferences, just constantly seeing our own likes reflected back at us, the more this unexpected human curation becomes pretty valuable. So that's a bit about where we're going. I think we're moving from a industrial model of selection, like Blockbuster, to a curated model of selection. We're moving from just a sort of Costco to an Amazon, from a budget retailer to Italy. We live in a world where political outcomes are dependent on the curation of web platforms. We live in a world where some of the most influential people are curators. Some of the highest paid people are curators. We've gone from a broadcast model of media where, we sit down and we watch whatever's on the TV, we listen to whatever's on the radio, to a curated model whereby there's this enormous, vast, never-ending menu that we then select from. And in all of that, I think the kind of core common ground is that across the board, wherever you are, the more curation there is, the more value is being added. And I think that's the kind of core message that I have about the modern world. The more curation in almost any field, whatever it is you do, the more value you are imparting. And just sort of before wrapping up, I'd say there is another aspect to this that I have come to believe is more and more important. And that's that people today have become, to some extent, curators of their own lives. And let me kind of give you an example of this that is somewhat concrete. Again, and I think it probably applies certainly to a British audience, perhaps more than a Brazilian, but I hope you'll recognize what I mean. When people in Britain first started to take foreign holidays, probably in the 1960s and 1970s, all everyone in the country would do is get on an airplane to probably somewhere in the Mediterranean and go on the beach. And everyone's holiday would look like everyone else's holiday. And, everyone was like, that's great. Finally, we have sunshine. We get to go to a foreign country. This is a new, amazing thing. But it was all the same. It was like the experience of going into Blockbuster. Now, when you look at the tourism industry, it's all based around very bespoke, very customized, very niche experiences. People might want to spend a few days on the beach. Yeah, sure. But then they want to go to a music festival. Then they want to go to another kind of festival. Then they want to go hiking up a mountain and meditate on top of it for 3 days. So people want these unique things. They want their holiday experience to be almost curated like an art exhibition. This is the Instagram world where people are literally curating their own lives on Instagram. It used to be the case that people's identities were quite fixed, quite monolithic. If you were an accountant, you probably did lots of predictable things. If you went to a football match at the weekend, that meant you were a certain kind of person. Now, if you go to a football match, maybe you're sitting next to somebody who's a taxi driver, maybe they're a hedge fund manager, but they go to the football. Then the next night, they're going to go to a Michelin-starred restaurant. People mix and match their experiences in a way that I would say, or at least want to or aspire to mix and match their experiences in a way that is kind of curation. People are curating their own identities. They're curating their own lives. And that's a kind of just important shift in how people understand themselves and how we go about living. So just to sum up, I started out being skeptical whenever I saw people talking about curation. I thought it was willfully borrowing this trendy art world word and using it just to sound cool, just because when you're giving a presentation at a conference, you need to talk about something that's quite cool. But the more I looked at it, the more I realized that in many industries, the key problem today isn't scarcity, it's that there's too much. There's too much choice. That we are so overloaded with choice that it actually paralyzes people. There's been a lot of research on this and the psychology of choice. You know, we would rather just not make a choice than to make the wrong choice. So as soon as you're presented with a lot of options, it makes you not even want to choose. It makes you want to leave the shop. So in this world, curation is actually the answer. It's what enables us to get through. It's how businesses can keep adding value at a time of complete excess. Moreover, that this idea of curation applies to so many different areas that we wouldn't usually think. It's not just about technology. It's about all content. It's about all data. It's about anything where there is a lot of options. So that might be finance. It might be running a shopping mall. It's an idea that has gone from being just a kind of little subgenre of the museum and art world to being something that has shaken the foundations of our politics, that has created some of the biggest companies of our age, like Google or Facebook or Amazon. It has even gone deep into our own identities and minds and sense of ourselves in the world. So for me, this idea of curation is one of the key ideas of the 21st century. And it's something that is just worth considering. And I hope you find that interesting and useful. Thank you very much for listening.
Obrigado, Michael. Prazer te ouvir. Obrigado por estar conosco aqui nesta tarde. Uma dúvida que surgiu enquanto nós te ouvíamos é a respeito desse aspecto que as redes sociais criaram curadores de suas próprias vidas. Então, como se nós todos tivéssemos nos tornado curadores de nossas próprias vidas, porque nós todos somos produtores de conteúdo hoje em dia, né? A curadoria está sendo um dos principais temas debatidos aqui no nosso evento hoje, no domingo. Nós estamos discutindo curadoria de revistas literárias, estamos discutindo a curadoria de eventos de literatura. Então, a minha pergunta para ti é, esse processo de curadoria, ele nasce, ele tem qualificações anteriores? O curador é uma pessoa que, é uma posição que exige qualificações anteriores? Ou é uma posição que surge estritamente da demanda?
I don't have a translation of that, so I'm not sure I can respond.
Okay, we're checking the translation. Just a minute.
I'm sorry, my Portuguese is not up to scratch.
Ele ouve a tradução agora? Can you hear the translation now, Michael?
No, but
Okay. I'm the translator, John. Can you hear me?
Oh yeah, I can hear now.
Okay.
Ok, I'll repeat the question. Eu vou repetir a pergunta então. Você falou que
You said
nós estamos nos
that
tornando
we are
curadores
becoming
das
curators
nossas
of
próprias
our
vidas,
own
das redes
lives,
sociais,
that
nos
social
tornaram,
networks, social media
curadores
have
nossas vidas.
transformed us into curators of our own
Nós
lives.
estamos
So,
discutindo a
we've been
curadoria em
discussing
diversos aspectos
curation in
aqui
several
nesse evento
aspects
hoje,
in this
nesse domingo.
event today, this
Estamos
Sunday.
falando de
We're talking
curadoria
about
relativa a
curation
eventos
related
literários.
to literary
Estamos debatendo a
events,
curadoria
about
em revistas
curation
voltadas à
in
literatura.
magazines
E eu queria
towards
saber de ti,
literature, and I would
Michael,
like to
se
hear from
uma
you
pessoa se torna
if
curadora
for a person to become a curator,
pessoais
what
anteriores,
personal
ou
previous
estritamente
qualifications
ela se
does the
torna
person
curadora
need to
por uma
have
demanda de
to
mercado
become a
ou de
curator,
trabalho?
or does the person become a curator just because of a demand?
So I think the main key thing that somebody needs is passion, and it really is as simple as that. It just starts with a really deep interest and passion, and that's why I say you can't fake being a curator or a good curator. Because actually a good curator is like any expert or any person who is extremely good at what they do. It takes time. It takes thousands of hours. It takes working at it over years and years and years. And, you know, the first thing that will make you do all of that is if you are really passionate. So I don't think there's a particular kind of person necessarily who becomes a good curator, but I think it all starts with this, you know, absolute love of something. So you know, for me, I love books and ideas and immerse myself in those worlds. And you know, I think hopefully that gives me a good chance of becoming a good curator. But, you know, somebody say, who doesn't read very much, but, you know, is maybe a massive fan of blues music and just spends all of their time listening to the blues and working on that, you know, they will then be an amazing curator of the blues. It's not about, you know, anything else other than the passion to really become an expert, to share that with people, to find the best of something. So that's where it starts for me. And then I think, you know, being a good curator is understanding that it is a service, that it is, you know, ultimately it's sort of like a performance being a curator. You know, you are not necessarily curating for yourself, you're curating for a goal, for a reason. And so I think that's where it probably becomes a little bit more specific. It's people who can translate their expertise via selections and via arrangements of things into a goal. So it's people who, yes, see the role of curator a bit like a performer who can put on a show and deliver to an audience.
Porém, Michael,
However, Michael,
tem trecho aqui
there is
no
a
teu
section
livro,
here in your book
que você escreve.
that you write.
Leonardo DiCaprio
DiCaprio is a curator of a beneficent art,
curador de festival de cinema.
and another person is a curator of a movie festival. In the last year, you see a lot of celebrities talking about curators. Gwyneth Paltrow as a curator, Kim Kardashian as curator of A Closed Story, Madonna as curator of Art for Freedom, David Bowie, Pharrell Williams, Johnny Depp have been curators of something. So, you said that one of the qualifications for a person to become a curator is passion, is personal interest for a topic, right? So, in those cases, can we say that those celebrities that have a lot of privilege, that have so much easy access to several markets, so have they become curators for passion or just because they want to manage their celebrity?
Well, the first thing to say is there are curators and then there are good curators. So, you know, anyone can kind of be a curator if that's sort of what you're doing, but it doesn't mean you're a good curator. It doesn't mean that what you're doing is helpful or useful. So, you know, that's the distinction that needs to be made. And generally, I'm always trying to talk about what makes good curation. So, you know, anyone can just make a bunch of random selections. You know, I could go and try and, you know, educate people about blues music, but I'd be a really bad curator, because even though I might try and do it, doesn't make me good at it, doesn't make me really understand the music. And I think that's what's happening quite a lot of the time with these sort of celebrity curators is, well, yes, they might be curating, but is it actually good curation? Is it really helping? Or is it actually just sort of nonsense? I don't know. You know, often it might be. I think there's another important thing to say is that I think if you're getting paid in order to make a particular selection, that's not curation either. Like, curation can't be, you know, you can't be paid to choose something and that be good curation. So, you know, let's say a bookshop is a really good example of curation. A well-curated bookshop is something that's really delightful and helpful to readers. But if the publishers have just paid money to the bookshop to have their books on the tables, that's not curation. It's curation when the bookseller thinks, right, you know, I think this book next to this book next to this book are going to be things that our readers will be interested in, and that will produce a really interesting display. And we do make money out of that because people come in, they buy books, they discover books they otherwise wouldn't have, and then they buy them. But the business model is curation, but you're not getting paid directly for the curation. So, you know, if there's a celebrity curator on Instagram who's just sharing everything and getting paid for that, that's not curation. That's kind of marketing. And that's a really important distinction. It's really fundamental that curation is folded into other business models. And that's what it's doing. You know, if a newspaper editor is getting paid to run one particular kind of story, that's not curation. You know, that's just not how it works. So the key thing to always remember is almost anything can be curation today. But the question to ask is it good curation?
Perfect.
I think we could get a good perspective about curation, the impact of curation in culture, in consumerism, in the relationship of people in the world. We have been talking to Michael Baskar. He's the writer of Curation, the Power of Selection in a World of Access. So we thank you very much for being here with us in our first edition of the International Literário Festival in Gramado. I hope next time you can be here personally with us, and I thank you very much for sharing your ideas with us. Muito obrigado por me ter.
I would love to be with you in Brazil in future, which is a country I've always wanted to visit. So I really do hope to see you in person.
Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much. See you later.
Boa noite.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Para informações da programação, filigram.com.br ou dos QR Codes espalhados pelo evento.